colleagues is younger than us. Thank you. So we are delighted to start the next session. I have with us Mr. Nandakumar Sarvade from Revit and Mr. Sachin Yadav from Deloitte. So Mr. Sarvade, please take over. Yeah, for 40 minutes. Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll try to fit it in that. You want to give me the mic? Yeah, I'll give you that. And you would like to, that's the mic. Okay. So you can't be too far from that.
Okay. No, I don't walk much around. Yeah.
I got to pin it away. Try to stay close to this.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So, post-lunch session, a difficult job to do, but I'll try to keep you busy. I have many slides, so I'll try to move at a fast clip. But at any point of time, please feel free to interrupt and give your observations. I'll try to respond to them as much as I can. But great to be back in the campus and this building particularly. I came to the campus first in 1982 for my master's, and I was here in Hostel 4 for 2 years. And then after 20 years, I came back to this building for my PhD coursework in School of Management, which I spent 2 semesters doing classes and great time on the campus, sabbatical from my government job. And then of course I realized that PhD was not my cup of tea, so I kind of quietly gave it up. And then we are here 20 years later. I of course keep coming back here. You mentioned about Professor Phatak. He was on our Revit board, and we would come and meet him in School of IT for various briefings and so on. But wonderful, great memories, and great to see all of you here in this sylvan setting, so to say. I'll start the story, and I hope the story illustrates some of the things which we discussed earlier. And this is a slightly older story now. Somebody known to me, again from IIT Bombay, called me up saying that a friend of his needs some help. She works in London in the field of environment, which was my master's specialization. And her father, who is this gentleman on the screen, Lieutenant General Sushil Kumar, who had retired in 1986. So I joined the Indian Police Service in 1987. He already retired then. And now, of course, well into his 90s. Nobody stays here. He stays here by himself because, as we know, older people in India don't have their children with them. They live somewhere else. He had his pension account and bank, 2 accounts in one particular bank. One day somebody comes to him saying that he has been sent by the bank, and the bank would like to install some mobile apps on his phone. And so he's a old person, very trusting, and he allowed that person to install the apps, after which 19 lakh rupees got transferred. So bread and butter cybercrime, so to say. Now the distress of this lady was quite there, that she was trying to get help, not able to do so. So I had to speak to Delhi police, get a case registered and so on. I don't think any money could be retrieved, but I think it has lost focus. Yeah.
No, it just had to.
Right. So the questions are more important than the facts, which are very simple. Now, in this case, somebody knew that he had account in a particular bank. That was point number 1. And that there was a pension account and there is a checking account. Checking account and saving account had smaller sums. Pension account had larger sums, and money could be moved into this account. And then the fraud. Why would a 90-year-old person be allowed by the bank to avail of mobile banking by activating it without asking any questions. I mean, I know there are a lot of bankers. I have worked in bank myself, and the bank's approach to this is very, undistinguished, so to say. No differentiation. Customers are treated more from income to the bank point of view than from their propensity to fall for a fraud. Then, in this case, multiple transactions happened. Velocity checks about what is the history of the account, how quickly money is moving out, why are so many transactions happening. Nobody from the bank seemed to have worried. I don't know whether they had a system to flag those also or not, but that's for deeper investigation. I'm just giving you from what I knew from the public domain. Now, will this be customer negligence under the RBI circular? Yeah, customer has allowed somebody to come and install an app in his phone. It is definitely customer negligence, so no compensation to be paid. Now, the other question is, I will show some numbers later. This 319 crore in 3 years is an old number now. It has gone much up now. But how cyber frauds and how bank frauds, loan frauds are comparable, not comparable, that is the point I would make. And what is the efficacy of the appellate mechanism? What is the customer focus in banks? Some of these issues I wanted to flag. And of course, police, as you will see later, have very little capacity to deal with this kind of very large volume fraud now already. So this was one case which I thought would be interesting, because all of us see such people around us, and they are trusting, they are taking somebody else's help to get banking services, and they are very vulnerable to this kind of frauds, including investment frauds, which are now the flavor of the day. But if you have to look at how personal information is to be protected, including bank passwords, including OTPs, including other demographics which enable an attacker to very convincingly get a victim to cooperate with what's happening. So this was a paper which came out which showed how different sensors on a phone, and there's a list of them there, how they individually and together can profile the user to such a degree of granularity that the user himself or herself is not aware of that personality that the person will have. And some of these are barometer, for example. If you are climbing stairs, your watch is telling you that you have climbed 5 flights today, right? Some sensor is measuring that. In this particular study, what they did was the person is holding a phone, tapping various characters on the screen, and there are movements of the phone which the sensors are picking up. And with certain degree of accuracy, 99% accuracy, the phone is knowing what is being typed without having a visibility into the box in which the password is being typed, right? So any app which accesses these sensors will know the behavior and the secrets of the phone owner. And this is something which somebody was talking about, the app permissions, whether they required one time, they required continuous basis, what do they require, who holds apps accountable for this, are app stores capacitized to do the scanning and deny or have those permissions in perpetuity. It's your guess as good as mine. Now, in this kind of scenario, is it really fair to expect people to protect their secrets? Don't give up secrets to anyone except your bank. Now, Jan talked about the DPDP regime which is going to come in, and consent. Everybody talks of consent, how consent is important, informed consent is so critical. Now, this is a very theoretical construct that has been put out by the European Union people, which has been copied here. And if you ask anybody except who is a privacy individual, privacy professional, they will not even know what is consent and what are the aspects of the consent. So there is a paper here which I happen to see. So there are, when you are giving consents, you have time. When you are giving consent, you have time constraints. You have knowledge gaps. You have cognitive biases, and you have service dependence. Like if you don't give consent, service will be denied to you. So you are in a very short frame of mind, saying that I need to go ahead. Just let's tick and go ahead. So this is one part of from the data subject point of view. Then there are very powerful marketing people who are nudging and coercing to get that consent, right? Very long consent form is there. Some of them will ask you to scroll, and then the I agree button is below, and then you will get a satisfaction that I have read or at least scrolled through, and then you agree and so on. Nobody explains the legal language into layperson's language, right? So consents are collected and they are taken as the irrefutable proof that you have agreed to give away your data to third parties and for various use cases, and so on. So I will leave this slide for you to look at later, but it is a very complex scenario that we are dealing with so many apps, so many variables, so many services coming, and everything is digital. Nobody either wants to go to a bank branch or wants many more services legitimately. But then we have to be aware of what the technological environment is about. So coming to the payment fraud aspect. So I think Vishy is here. He talked about those billions of transaction numbers. But these are the beginning, right? The headroom is way up there. It is just starting to happen. And I remember the Nilekani Group report, which said Singapore has 700 transactions per year per user. I think we're already way ahead of that. And obviously, cash withdrawals also up. So everybody in government and probably RBI is also worrying why people are withdrawing cash, why they're not doing digital so much. So digital will grow. So that is just, we are at the beginning of the curve, whichever way the curve is going. The malicious activities has been automated, like with machine learning, AI, profiling, 5G, bandwidth cost, more people to do frauds. Everything is working towards attack surface, not attack surface, but attacker surface increase, right? So then some numbers about what Certin got, but Certin then came out with a with a regulation that you have to report attacks to Certin, so probably the number will be greater. It's slightly older slide, so sorry for that. But 2023 numbers will be bigger than 13 lakh attacks. Now, people talk of police being responsible for catching crooks, right? The classic framing. Now, police have very little bandwidth, as we know. They are dealing with people driving cars and killing people, elections happening, Kumbh Mela going on. So, for fraud, there is very small bandwidth available in the police. Now, this is evidenced by the number that 20 lakh cybercrime complaints have been registered with I4C, which is the portal, out of which only 2% have been taken for investigation. And many of these complaints, will just go into statistics, dustbin or storage, whatever you want to call it. Now, it is humanly impossible to investigate all cases. And as Mr. Ramesh said, courts are clogged. They don't want to take up more volumes. So don't look at police to solve the cybercrime problem unless it is seen as a organized crime problem, which is a different way to look at it. In which case you don't look at each case, but aggregate cases and then go after people who are running those rackets, and then you have harsher laws and you have asset immobilization and you have faster trials, hopefully, and so on. But that is on the law enforcement side, that is the situation. So the point of this slide is prevention is the only way to really deal with cybercrime. There's no way cybercrime will ever be tackled and defeated by reactive approaches. Now, this is my favorite point, that banks, and I have a banker, so my banker friends here will excuse me. Banks lose so much money on loan frauds. Like this is from RBI's 3-year annual reports, and slightly older data again. Last couple of years data is not here. But if you look at the bank frauds, amounts in crores, So 18-19, total amount of money lost in bank frauds was 71,000. 1920, 1,85,000. 2021, 1,38,000. In all, this will come to 4 lakh crore kind of amount. And money, you see the breakup there, which kind of banks and which kind of areas. So advances where loans are given is by far the larger chunk of, by number it is 53%, but amount wise it is 90%, 98%, 99%. So this is the by far the largest kind of category of fraud. So we spend a lot of time worrying about cybercrime because it can hit us, but actually the public money is at stake more in loan frauds than cybercrime. That's a important point from a public policy point of view, because You have to allocate your resources depending on the severity of the problem and not the salience of the problem or not the availability bias that we can do something about something, so let us do it kind of thing. Okay, so fraud is a very understudied area, as I always feel. I've been a cop for 20 years. I used to be in CBI for 7 years doing bank fraud investigations. And I myself told you how police deprioritized investigations, fraud and so on. In academics also, you will not see too much of theory in frauds, though the volumes can be very large. You have very sophisticated models on credit risk, market risk, and other kinds of risk. But fraud kind of flies under the radar. But there is an association of certified fraud examiners which talks about 5% as the fraud volume, and it's a report which comes every 2 years. And this has been the finding that actually this is the volume of fraud, because it is either not recognized or it is not taken note of, and it kind of flies under the radar. Now, RBI report I already talked about in dollar terms, because this was a slide made for an international audience. Loan fraud is 51.5 billion and payment frauds only 42 million. So that was the size, comparative size. Again, global card fraud was 28.65 billion. This is mostly Visa, MasterCard kind of numbers coming in. And 6.1 basis points, that is 0.06% in terms of value, transactions in the denominator and fraud in the numerator. So how will technology help us deal with fraud? That is an open question I wanted to say. On cyber risk in particular, unlike other risks like a risk of a cyclone or any business continuity risks which are there, in fraud there is an adversary on the other side. So it is an adaptive risk. There is somebody who is trying to outwit you and make you part with your resources. So this complicates the situation, because whatever you do, the other party is going to do something better than what you are doing to outwit you. And they also operate in a very specialized ecosystem now. So somebody will write a malware, somebody will distribute it, somebody will send mails, somebody will hire mules, somebody will cash out. They provide 24/7 help desks for their malware and so on. So it's a very sophisticated ecosystem. And many of the cyber criminals are actually on the payroll of the local intelligence people who want them to hack into other countries and so on. So it's a very protected group also. So that's why you will see it continuing and going on. I already talked about how attacks are more frequent, technology cost is going down, risk assessment become difficult. So if you have risk of X, then you can allocate Y resources. But if the risk suddenly goes in the next one to 10X, how do you raise your resources? And there is a gestation period to make those resources work and create the kind of outcomes that you want. And that is where the cyber risk, which is cyber security plus fraud, both together, this kind of scenarios are there. A lot of risks are actually not only losing money, but losing money in investigation, as banks will see this as a cost center, litigation and so on. So in Indian banking, this has been one of the interesting things, that the definition of a bank fraud is itself nowhere to be seen in RBI regulations or something. So this definition actually came from a study group set up by RBI only, and which we used when we worked in the Gopal Krishna working group in 2011. What is a bank fraud? So if somebody receives a call and then makes a fund transfer willingly, is it a bank fraud or not? Should we measure it or not? Does the bank have responsibility to towards that payment or not? I will come to that later. But the definition itself is a problem that I think has not been resolved. So this definition is from a study group and it is a suggested definition. But you will see the last line, with or without any monetary loss to the bank. First important thing about solving any problem is to measure it, right? If you don't measure, don't acknowledge, the problem doesn't get the attention, the resources that it deserves. So measuring of bank fraud has always been a problem. And I know I used to look at this. Two banks had similar kind of card user bases. One bank would report promptly all cases dealing with credit cards. Other bank would not report, with some definition saying that we don't have that fraud. And one bank is reporting number in a couple of hundred, other bank is reporting every month number in 3,000-4,000. And then it became a point saying, why are you reporting so much fraud? The board was asking the bank fraud team and so on. So eventually, numbers went down as per my understanding. But this differentiation in how banks treat fraud and how they report it and how the regulator doesn't ask them questions is an area which needs attention. And of course, as you see, this goes for the police statistics also. Governments are very keen to show crime is going down. Nobody wants to say, okay, crime is going up because volumes are going up, crime will go up, population is growing up, so crime will go up. That kind of logical answers don't work in public space. Everybody wants to show that problem is under control and there is no problem at all. Now, if we look at the problem, if we want to solve the problem, and we looked at the numbers, but cyber crime as a problem, payment fraud as a problem, hits individuals who may or may not have the capacity to absorb the loss. And it is also a factor which may affect trust in the payment system and the adoption of digital payments in the long run. So there are many issues which are with this. Also, the weaker ones always get affected, right? People who don't understand, older people, people who are distracted, who are too busy, and so on. So if we look at the stakeholders, there are multiple stakeholders, but obviously banks and fintechs and payment service providers are at the forefront. Law enforcement has a central role, because everybody goes there after an incident has happened. Regulators also need to have understanding, look at the regulation that they're putting out. There are other stakeholders like governments. Telecom is a very important part of the infrastructure because telecom is a business. One of my ex-telecom friend is here. He'll tell you the average revenue per user is into 200, 300, 400. And how much money telecom will allocate for fraud control, KYC, is anybody's guess, because it is not a viable business if you do things too in a rigorous manner, etc. So there are incentives, economic incentives always work much stronger than any other control measures. And then there are e-com merchants also, which is a very important element of the ecosystem, because frauds sometimes send money, buy goods, and goods get delivered, and there's a lag which can be used to block those goods and so on. So from a data analytics point of view, from putting controls, from sharing information, I think it is important to evolve that taxonomy, which is there in cybersecurity, for example, the sticks, taxi formats, etc. But in fraud, it is not there. So there will be objects, relationships, constraints, which I leave to the technical people to think about and then see how they can create a model which is enabling collective defense. Because as we heard, everybody is doing their best, but it is not good enough. I mean, it can do better. Not good enough is probably a judgmental term, but it can do better. How can it do better? By connecting the information sources and ensuring that the data becomes available for people to take decisions on. So whose responsibility it is? And this is an important question to answer when we are talking of public policy on how payment frauds have to be reduced. So RBI has a circular issued in 2017 on limiting liability of customers. So it clearly says in which situations the customer is liable, what are the timelines for reporting, and what happens after reporting is done. Third-party breaches, there is no liability at all, and so on. And very importantly, which doesn't see much validation, is the burden of proving that customer is liable is on the bank. If a customer says, I have not done anything wrong and this is not my fault, the bank will have to say, okay, we sent you OTP, you received the OTP, and that OTP was put by you, and that's how the fraud has happened. So many times we assume things that OTP sent by bank is directly going to the phone. It is not. It is going to the SMS aggregator, to the telecom service provider, and to the phone. And there have been documented cases of SMS aggregators, somebody sitting and leaking out OTPs, and so on. Controls in telecom have improved, but this was a first case of a telecom employee leaking OTPs was reported long back from South Africa. And so this, if the customer says, I have not done a transaction, the bank will have to incur a lot of effort to say, okay, you did, and this is the evidence for that. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be known to anyone or operating as it is. Now, obviously, if something is very large and affecting a large number of people, it goes to the politicians, right? They hear from their constituents and say, kuch karo, isme bahut problem hai. So politicians raise these points, and elsewhere, Singapore, this has been a very hotly debated topic. So people, the legislator, one legislator there is saying that the bank should take on the responsibility for this. they are able to monitor transactions, they can block fund flows, and they know the latest technological developments. Like deep fake was one point which came up, right? So do you think an individual person will ever know of deep fake unless he gets duped by deep fake by the time it's too late? It is up to the technology teams to really look at the trends and then put controls to deal with those trends. So the point of view is it is in not individual customer, but the bank which should be doing it. And of course, why not give physical tokens? Why sending SMS-based OTPs, which is there on the mobile? If the mobile is compromised, then everything is lost. So this is the voice which is there. Singapore has implemented something which is for phishing frauds, and it talks about obviously any developed society, citizens are supposed to be aware, right? That is the expectation. And it is not a good idea to assume that citizens cannot bear any responsibility for whatever they do. They have to bear some responsibility. So this model looks at that. And so if the bank has not sent any alert, then it is bank's fault. If the telecom service provider has sent an alert which contains a phishing URL, it is the telecom service provider's fault. So they have to put in measures to scan SMSs going to customers and find terms which will indicate potential fraud and not deliver that SMS. Only verified SMS handles are allowed to send banking SMSs and so on. So that kind of controls are expected, and then if the customer has still fallen, then he bears the loss. But most importantly, the recent initiative in UK for authorized push payment fraud is what I will spend some time on. What happens here is the journey is a victim is targeted by the fraudster. Victim responds to that. So authorized push payment is where the victim is willingly making the transaction, and then the transaction happens. So there are two scenarios. One is wrong recipient, so money is going to the wrong person, or for wrong purpose. Money is intended for one thing, but it's actually going for something else. So these are the losses for APP, authorized push payment fraud in UK in last year, about 459 million, which is about 5,000 crore rupees. Now the new regulation says that customers will exercise this standard of care. So one is if the payment service provider is giving an alert saying that this is a potentially fraudulent transaction, the customer if doesn't heed that and goes ahead, then it is customer's fault. Okay. Now the second is if there is a problem, the customer is expected to report promptly, but the time given is 13 months maximum outer limit. Before that, the fraud has to be reported, and the customer should of course respond to any follow-up queries from the payment service provider. So what is the payment service provider is expected to do in this case? So they have to give specific warnings before a payment is executed, and those warnings should show the intended recipient of the payment is likely to be a fraudster. Now, how will a payment service provider know? Will the payment service provider know or suspect that transaction is suspicious? So there is a sender PSP, there is a receiver PSP. Between the two, can they find out if one account is receiving a lot of incoming amounts, similar amounts, frequent amounts, merchant account, not merchant account, merchant, grocer merchant but receiving 50,000 rupees, I am just giving some Indian number, repeatedly. So there is something anomalous there. If they share information, maybe they can give this warning, and they are now expected to give this warning. Warning should be consumer, scam and transaction specific. This is the expectation from the PSP. The degree of negligence will also be there from the customer, which will depend on number of warnings. If the warning is very explicit, still customer has acted on it, then it is the customer's fault. Complexity of the scam, any history of the customer, so a customer is constantly falling for something, then the degree of negligence is higher. So this is the kind of responsibility on the payment service provider. And obviously if there is a fraud, the reimbursement has to be done within 5 days. It is split between the sender PSP and receiving PSP. And interestingly, the top 14 PSPs have been told to submit fraud data, and this data is published. So you know which PSP has more frauds. So it acts as a reputational constraint in a good way, positive way, that we have to do something. Data will be published in terms of per 1,000 transactions, per 1,000 user base, etc. But this is like, what Niti Aayog used to do, aspirational shaming, so that people put some effort into improving their performance. So this is the and there, of course, not everybody is compensated, only small consumers, micro enterprises, charities, etc. And there's a cap, of course, which is prescribed. And there's, of course, a strategy which I will leave for later reading for you. It's all there in the their website anyway. Now, as we see, payment payment fraud is an ecosystem problem in India also. So this is a recent infographic which I thought will be interesting to look at. In a year, 17 million mobile connections have been disconnected, which is about 1% of the entire mobile. So you can see the fraud activity is so large, and so many connections are indulging in it, that this is the number which is there. I hope it is correct, but it really shows the volumes which are there. And interestingly, if you see on the right side, 10,000 crore have been lost in 1 year. Now, we saw some 300 crore number earlier. This is number of 2023 in almost 7 lakh complaints. So it's a huge problem already, and that's why we need to pay attention to this. Okay, so I'll come to the last part and we'll leave some time for discussion. So recently Ross Anderson died. Some of you will know that he was one of the foremost security thinkers, and his book Security Engineering is a book, 3rd edition, very recommended for anyone to read who wants to understand security and so on. So he talks of economics of security, and this is a very popular topic because incentives are very important. Who is incentivized for doing what, that really decides the outcomes. So he talks of public goods. This is taken from one of his books, which are non-rivalrous. So security is a public good. Payment security, street safety, they're all public goods. So they are not non-rivalrous. So my using them doesn't mean that there is less available for you. And non-excludable, there's no way somebody can be excluded from consuming them. So this is the definition of public good. But he says that uncoordinated markets are unable to provide public goods in socially optimal quantity. So a market which is not coordinating with each other, as we see now, people working in silos, this market is not producing the desired outcome. So then it becomes the government's responsibility to make this available. And he gives this very graphic example of saying, I don't have anti-aircraft gun because it is government job to protect me from an aerial attack and so on. So likewise, information security has very strong externalities. So if there is a insecure asset device, it creates problems for others. So any not properly designed, configured system will create those externalities which are there. So this is something which is important to keep in mind, that by not investing, not having proper control, not operating them well, is there an externality which is getting created in this. And as I said, the externality is borne by people who are late adopters, rural people, older people, people who don't understand English. I hope now all banks send SMS in local language, etc. But what we see is very English oriented, urban, tech savvy kind of a approach which needs to be evaluated, relooked at. So according to me, some of the design principles in this are, number one is, who should solve the problem? Should it be dispersed among 140 crore people? I am just giving a round number which is in vogue nowadays, but or it should be given to people who can solve the problem, people as in entities. So whoever is best placed has to be given the job. Some customers are more vulnerable than others, so they need more protection. So this categorization, this kind of approach has to be introduced. Otherwise, we will see in disproportionate injuries to people who are least placed to bear those. Sharing of information has to be done, and we saw telecom now coming into play because government is now trying to get them together. So mobile numbers are making frequent outgoing calls, fraud calls, crowdsourcing that information, looking at their KYC, blocking them. All of this has to be done, and that is one way of sharing information. But interestingly, I heard a very interesting story the other day. Somebody receives a call saying that have you enabled your card for international transaction? So obviously the caller said, I'm from your bank. And we are seeing some suspicious activity. Have you enabled your card for international transaction? The person said, no. He said, can you switch on your video and let me look at your card? So he showed the card, backside, front side. And then OTP comes, and they are able to see the OTP. And then a transaction happens on an e-commerce site. And then the call gets disconnected. So the person immediately receives a SMS from a bank saying that this transaction, you have done the transaction. If you are not done, then call this number and dispute it order. So he calls the number and disputes. And then eventually he gets a credit, temporary credit. But eventually the bank says, you have given OTP, so it is your fault. You will not get benefit. Now his point is, you had time to, because the money spent on an e-commerce website for buying an iPhone or something, you had time to go to the e-commerce service, e-commerce site, block the transaction, not deliver the iPhone. When I'm saying that this is fraud, why are you not doing that? But bank obviously will not have those linkages unless there is a platform and information sharing mechanism which is already in place. When the e-com company will also take care and block the transaction and so on. So there is a big ecosystem which is interconnected, and that needs to share information together. As I said, if trust gets affected, Trust Lab will have a lot of more work to do. But I think trust is important, and we'll see much more growth if trust is maintained. Disclosures are important. Like currently, this is all hush hush, not disclosures. I4C is busy doing things, but they don't publish any analysis reports, put out information in public domain, because everybody learns. And it doesn't, they don't learn by some fraud team member reading some chart and getting some gyan. Everybody has to understand, and then it will be used in a wider sense. As I said, taxonomy is required for putting in not only connecting data sources, but also then using them to track scenarios and put in models, train models, put controls. It's a very dynamic practice. I mean, I always say fraud is 1% theory and 99% practice. So you have to have teams which are really dedicated, who understand what is happening, and ensure that the UCO bank kind of case doesn't happen where 3 days the fraud is going on, no reconciliation, no fraud team saying why we receiving, why these withdrawals are happening as money is coming to the account. So fraud teams, fraud investment, as Mr. Ramesh said in the beginning, fraud department has to be really built and scaled up and made more capable, and given the technology tools to really become effective. But at the end of the day, you have to keep the customer at the middle of it. You can't say P&L, technology problems, vendor issues, senior management, blah, blah. But if everybody keeps the customer, I think that's what we will see the results if we follow some of these, is my take. I write about frauds, all kinds of frauds on my LinkedIn page, including digital arrest frauds, which have become very rampant. Of course, these are all very marquee cases which are very large. The largest case happened in Mumbai, where some person spent 25 crore rupees to get out of a digital arrest. 25 crore rupees. It is I have the copy of it. I won't be able to show it to you, but this is the kind of hijacking of people's psyche which happens when fraudsters are using. There are 3 motivations. One is fear, second is greed, and third one is less commonly used, but helpfulness. You want to help somebody, so you end up doing something which otherwise you will not do. But fear is the strongest one, greed is the next one, and then this is what is used by the attackers. So I think fraud is a very interesting area, and it can behave with a lot of attention and technology stuff, but a lot of public policy also. So I'll end here, and if you have any comments, questions, I'll be happy to answer those.
That was a brilliant presentation, sir. As usual from you, I still feel that on the design principle, some amount of spending on customer awareness should possibly be included. Particularly, maybe it's time that we kind of bring that under the CSR ambit of the bank, so that some amount of expenses are spent towards that. And that will go a long way in at least educating the people about the various MOs. Right, today the people here in this room will be aware of some of the MOs, including digital arrest, etc. But many of them don't know. And for many of them, it will be the first time. That will also go a long way in helping preventing frauds, because it cannot be a one-sided approach from either the bank or the regulators, or the customer's role is also equally important in that?
Absolutely. So I always say the approach has to be people, process, technology in that order. So people, the consumer has to become more aware, and obviously consumer cannot be spoon fed till is for years together. People have to become aware. So sometimes this is a very interesting point when a customer is being onboarded on a digital product, net banking or mobile banking. At that time, the motivation of the customer to learn about things is very high because he wants to use the product. Later, he will get irritated if obviously now banks want to show, fixed deposit ads or cross sale order. But awareness material also should find some place there, and it has to be done in a much more mindful way. I mean, no reflection on any fraud team's efforts, but the kind of savvy we see in marketing, gamification, the kind of picking the curiosity of the person that we don't see in fraud. They're very nice, better designs now as we go forward. But awareness itself is an area of research, and a lot of psychology has to come in. But marketing people know it well. So how to do it, how to localize it, how to use more of a personalized approach. Now that AI is there to say, okay, this person will understand this kind of approach better, this language, this terminology, it will work. So we have to be more imaginative, as fraudsters are imaginative. Anti-fraud professionals also have to be imaginative in making awareness as a main plank about how to protect the customer. I agree with you.
So I have one question. You have this multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication. Now, when you have facial recognition for opening a bank app, why can't you have facial recognition for undertaking a transaction?
So some of these frauds that I mentioned.
Fraudster can't actually the whole issue of.
So there are two kinds of frauds. One is the authorized one is the unauthorized one. Both are important categories to identify. Unauthorized one controls will work. So things like OTPs, unlocking the bank account, and obviously many banks now call customer beyond a certain threshold, saying that please press 1 to approve the transaction and so on. So that works well for unauthorized transactions. But there are large category of authorized transactions also happening, which is the point we saw in the UK also, 5,000 crore worth of frauds, which also here the numbers will be now comparable, which will need different approaches.
May I add one point, Ramesh? I think the challenge here is twofold, right? So one is today the customer themselves do the transaction. So there, whatever you try to reach out to him is not going to. He is possibly not in a listening mode. So he will actually authenticate all those transactions himself, and it will get completed. And the second aspect is, at the end of the day, even a biometric, be it a facial auth or a fingerprint, in that sense, it's not dynamic, right? It's still static. To that extent, OTP is at least dynamic. Each transaction it changes. Somewhere, if this information gets compromised, the damage can be much more. I think there are two different, kind of thoughts on this use of biometrics.
So, in addition to this, what she said, the biometric authentication factor is generated at the customer end, not on the bank end. That makes a difference. OTP is generated at the bank. That's why we do not allow even third party to generate the any authentication factor at their end and authenticate the customer on their platform. We bank always get customer bring them on the bank platform and they authenticate. So biometric, fingerprint, everything is in the customer end. Okay, there is no control on the bank end.
I think that's a good point. One of these USPs of iPhones Apple used to talk about is the biometric doesn't leave the phone. It is stored locally and it is validated locally only when the phone is getting unlocked and so on. So that is safer. In fact, RBI has also told banks to look at other ways of not SMS-based OTPs, but other kinds of ways of generating that OTP. Well, that will help. But if the device gets compromised, then that problem will continue.
I think that's what you mentioned in some of the design principles, and what she is also talking of awareness. I think from the banks or an implementer perspective, as a preventive step, right? Effort should also be to make these transactions foolproof. That means you can't make mistakes to convert a transaction.
Right.
As long as that effort is also.
Yeah.
Where I was
One
heading.
example of BGR.
Right.
We authenticate. So
when you register for DGR, you have to click your photograph, it will authenticate with your Aadhaar photo, right?
No, it will store it, and then next time you are there, it will verify that same image with you.
How that person is getting authenticated?
There is an enrollment phase.
Only your Aadhaar number gets,
So, coming back to that,
it gets verified. At the gate entry, it verifies what you have shown. I'm talking about while registering for DGR. When you register through your app, it only captures your.
It will capture and store that image.
Where it is the biometric is checked with the Aadhaar, but not in DGR.
DGR is only for your next visit to the airport. It verifies.
Maybe you can take one or two questions.
Yeah, can we have a multimodal surveillance being done on the local phone? Like the phone call coming in, the SMS, if the SMS is kind of an investment fraud or a kind of a click fraud, okay, and plus the voice surveillance and trying to transcribe it to figure out if there are characteristics of a fraud, then individually generated transactions, even though knowingly, okay, could alert it at least to the individual. So multimodal surveillance should be an answer, right?
So I think it's a good business idea. Somebody puts AI agent there, and agent will listen and say, okay, don't do this. This is potential. But what you see is, and I used to see this when I was in a bank. People who are victims of frauds, they never read any awareness material sent to them. They will delete it. Anyway, emails sent on awareness material have less than single digit opening rate, firstly. Secondly, those who are interested in will read, think, is bar kya hai, dekhte hai. They are fully aware of what is the problem. The victims have no time or no interest in this. Yeah.
One more question in the end.
Just a comment on your point about the taxonomy and defining fraud in general properly. So this also has an effect on the automation of fraud detection, where you are using AI to actually detect frauds and identify them. Because for these kind of approaches, you need a very clear mathematical model or an optimization target to actually define what you are trying to prevent. But this keeps changing in response with your efforts. So whatever you do, they will change their approach. So technically defining it through a mathematical model becomes a challenge. And another point on implementation is where, so for online streaming services, they have ban rates. So they don't keep banning people who are abusive online. So they don't keep banning people incrementally on a very high frequency level. They wait for about a period of months, like 3 months or 6 months, and they issue ban waves. They ban multiple accounts in that ban wave. So this is to prevent giving them incremental feedback on their approaches. So they purposefully don't take action for a certain period of time, and then they issue ban waves.
Yeah, it's always a cat and mouse game. You have to keep adapting.
One last question, please.
Just thinking aloud. So I keep hearing OTPs are one of the major reasons of how the last point after which the financial fraud actually happens. So instead of maybe SMS aggregators sending the OTPs, why not give that option to the user to generate an OTP and send? So maybe that's another way of looking at it. Let's put the onus onto the customer because the customer has to take some amount of liability in that. So rather, while to protect my transaction, I'll be the one who can send an OTP whoever the bank over. So I think that might be one of the ways, to control certain amount.
For doing any transaction, the bank, your account in the bank has to be debited when you are doing a transaction. So the bank server has to confirm that you are the one who is doing the transaction. So they will do it by sending you a one-time password on a device which they would have enrolled, etc. There are different ways in which how they will ascertain your identity with certain degree of confidence. But the closure of that workflow will happen there. So it will be challenge response from that side rather than you are sending OTP doesn't make sense.
Flip that problem.
Mhm.
Flip that problem from the point of view of let the user say that okay, this is a valid transaction. Rather than the bank telling me that is this valid or not, then you say yes. Just thinking aloud.
Actually, the OTP we generally consider the second factor of authentication. So actually, second OTP is the authorization factor. So when you generate an OTP, it has a reference, number. Okay, against which it can be proven that this OTP is really, being used by the customer when there is a requirement to reconcile the transaction. Okay, it is not the point where to put the ball. Okay, whether at the customer end. It is to ensure the customer transaction is protected, and that's why bank need to generate the OTP at
For
their
the benefit of time, we have one other speaker. And we'll
Right.
So maybe we can take some of these questions maybe in tea break. Is that okay? Yeah. So thank you so
Right,
much.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Next we have Sachin